The school bell screamed, a loud metallic sound that usually meant freedom. But for one small boy, it just meant another day of trying to become invisible. His name was Leo, and he was 10 years old. In a school full of shouting kids and clattering locker doors, Leo was a whisper. He walked with his shoulders curled in, his eyes most often fixed on the scuffed toes of his shoes. He didn't have many friends, and that was how he liked it. Friends asked questions, and questions were dangerous. Lately, he had a very good reason to hide. A ugly purple and yellow mark bloomed around his left eye. It was a nasty bruise, the kind that tells a story you don't want to tell. When his teacher had first seen it that morning, her face had filled with worry. "Leo, what happened?" she had asked, her voice soft. Leo had just shaken his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I walked into a door," he mumbled. It was the oldest, saddest excuse in the world, but it was the one he had been told to use. He could still hear the gruff voice of his mother's new boyfriend, Mark, drilling the words into him. "You tell them you're clumsy, you hear me? You tell them you fell." So he did. But his teacher, a kind woman named Ms. Davison, didn't look like she believed him. He could feel her eyes on him throughout the day, a quiet, worried presence. She saw more than just the bruise. She saw how the sleeve of his worn-out jacket was a little too short, how he flinched when a book dropped loudly on the floor, and how he always seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. The worst part of the day was lunch. The cafeteria was a jungle of noise and movement. Leo found his usual spot at the very end of a long table, hoping to be left alone. But today, a bigger boy from his class, a kid who seemed to enjoy making others feel small, swaggered over. "Well, look what we have here," the boy sneered, his friends snickering behind him. The one-eyed monster. He reached out and snatched Leo's only apple from his lunch tray. "What are you going to do about it, monster?" Leo said nothing. He just stared at his empty tray, his heart hammering. Please just go away, he thought. Please. But the boy wasn't done. He gave Leo a hard shove, sending him tumbling off the bench and onto the cold, hard floor. Leo's notebook and pencils skittered across the linoleum. The laughter from the other kids felt like needles on his skin. He scrambled to gather his things, his cheeks burning with a hot mix of shame and anger. This was his life, getting pushed around at school and being scared to go home. Later that afternoon, as the final bell rang and the other kids rushed for the doors like a stampede, Ms. Davison called out to him. "Leo, could you stay behind for a moment, please?" A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He slowly walked to her desk, his head down. Was she going to yell at him for causing a scene? Was she going to call his mom? The thought of his mom's boyfriend finding out made him feel sick, but Ms. Davison didn't look angry. She pulled up a small chair next to hers and gestured for him to sit. The classroom was empty now, quiet except for the hum of the lights. The silence felt heavy. "Leo," she began, her voice so gentle it almost hurt, "I saw what happened at lunch. I'm very sorry that boy was so mean to you." Leo just nodded, unable to speak. He focused on a crack in the floor tile. "That bruise on your face," she continued carefully. "It looks painful. Are you sure you walked into a door?" The question hung in the air. Leo's throat felt tight. He could feel the tears starting to press behind his eyes, but he fought them back. "Boys don't cry," Mark always said. "Crying just gives people a reason to hit you harder." But Ms. Davison's kindness was like a crack in a dam. He had been holding so much inside for so long. The fear, the loneliness, the secret he carried everywhere like a heavy rock. He looked up and saw her face. It wasn't the face of someone who would get him in trouble. It was the face of someone who might actually understand. And then, the words just started to spill out. It began as a soft trickle, a whisper. It wasn't a door. And once he started, he couldn't stop. He told her about Mark. He told her about the yelling that shook the walls of their small apartment at night. He told her about the way Mark would get angry about little things, a dish left in the sink, the TV being too loud. He told her about the shoves, the hard grips on his arm that left finger-shaped bruises, and finally, about the punch that had given him the black eye. He told her how his mother would cry and beg Mark to stop, but she was just as scared as he was. "I don't have a dad," Leo whispered, his voice breaking. "There's no one to protect us. No one who isn't scared of him." Ms. Davison listened, her face a mask of sadness and concern. She didn't interrupt. She just let him talk. And for the first time in a very long time, Leo felt like someone was actually hearing him. Then a wild, crazy idea, Something he had seen on an old news report popped into his head. It was a desperate, silly thought, but it was the only one he had. "I saw on TV once," he said, his voice a little stronger. "There was a story about some bikers. Big, tough guys on motorcycles. They weren't bad guys. They helped a kid who was being hurt. They scared the bad people away." He looked at his teacher, his eyes wide and pleading. I heard bikers help people. Maybe one of them could be my dad. Just for a little while? Just so Mark gets scared and leaves us alone?" The idea sounded even more foolish saying it out loud. A biker being his dad, but in his 10-year-old mind it made perfect sense. He needed someone strong, someone who wasn't afraid, someone who could stand up to the monster in his home. And the men on the TV with their leather jackets and loud bikes looked like they weren't afraid of anything in the world. The idea, once planted, wouldn't leave him alone. It grew in the quiet, scary spaces of his mind, like a stubborn weed pushing through cracks in the pavement, all through the rest of the school day, and then through a tense, quiet evening at home where he and his mother moved around each other like ghosts. Leo thought about it. He watched Mark from the corner of his eye, seeing the way the man's heavy hands rested on the table, and he felt that familiar knot of fear in his stomach. He needed a dad. Not a real one, just someone to stand in front of him just once. The next morning, a plan started to form. It was a scary plan, the kind that made his heart feel like a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He knew he couldn't ask for permission. His mother would say no out of fear, and his teacher might feel she had to call someone official, which could make everything worse. So this was something he had to do himself. When the lunch bell rang, instead of going to the cafeteria, he slipped away. He told a monitor he felt sick and needed some air. The cool breeze outside felt good on his face. He walked quickly, his school backpack bouncing against his shoulders, heading towards the older part of town where the shops were a little dirtier and the buildings looked tired. He was looking for a place he had heard older kids whisper about, the Internet Cafe. It was a dark room filled with glowing computer screens, a place where people went to play loud games or get lost online. He had just enough money in his pocket, saved from a few forgotten lunch allowances. Pushing the heavy door open, he was hit by the smell of old carpet and stale air. A man with a bored expression sat behind a counter, barely looking up. Leo paid for 30 minutes on a computer and found a station in the corner, half hidden by a large poster. His small hands trembled as he typed the words into the search bar, Hell's Angels, and the name of his town. The screen filled with pictures and news articles. His eyes widened. There they were, men with long beards and serious faces, wearing leather vests covered with patches. They stood next to huge, shiny motorcycles that looked like they could roar loud enough to shake the world. They looked tough. They looked like they didn't flinch at anything. He scrolled through, his heart pounding. Then he found it. A grainy picture of a building. It wasn't a fancy clubhouse like in the movies. It was a plain gray building on an industrial street with a tall fence around it, but bolted to the front was a metal sign, and on that sign was the winged skull he had seen in the other pictures. This was the place. He scribbled the address on a scrap of paper from his pocket, his handwriting messy and rushed. He shoved the paper deep into his jeans pocket, feeling it crinkle against his leg. It felt like a secret, a dangerous, powerful secret. The walk home from school the next day was the longest of his life. Every car that passed made him jump. Every loud noise made him freeze. He walked his usual route for a few blocks, then with a deep breath, he turned and started walking in the opposite direction, towards the industrial part of town his mother had always told him to avoid. The streets grew quieter, filled with the sounds of his own footsteps and the distant hum of machinery. The air smelled different here, like oil and old concrete. He checked the crumpled paper in his sweaty palm over and over again, matching the numbers on the buildings to the numbers he had written down. And then he saw it. The gray building from the picture. It looked even more imposing in real life. The fence was high and the windows were dark. Parked in a neat row along the side were several motorcycles covered with tarps, but he could see their bulky shapes. This was it. His mouth felt dry as dust. For a long time, he just stood across the street, hidden partly behind a large dumpster. He watched the building. Nothing moved. No one went in or out. What was he doing? This was a stupid, crazy idea. These were dangerous men. What if they yelled at him? What if they were just like Mark? The thought of Mark's angry face, the memory of the punch that gave him the black eye flashed in his mind. The fear of going back to that, of another night of yelling and crying, was suddenly stronger than the fear of the unknown men in the building. He had to try. He had nowhere else to go. He crossed the street, his legs feeling like they were made of wood. The sidewalk in front of the building seemed to stretch for miles. He stood before the heavy, unmarked door. There was a single rusty buzzer next to it. It looked like it could bite. He lifted a trembling finger. He hesitated, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was his last chance to run. But he didn't. He pushed the button. A static crackle made him jump. Then a deep, rough voice came through the small speaker. It wasn't a shout, but it wasn't friendly either. It was just one word, yeah? The sound of the voice was so real, so close it stole the breath from his lungs. All the words he had practiced vanished from his head. He stood there, silent and frozen. The voice came again, a little sharper. "Hello, who's there?" That jolted him into action. He leaned close to the grill, his voice coming out as a high, thin squeak, barely a whisper. "My name is Leo," he said. Then he forced the rest of the words out, the words he had carried in his heart all the way here. "Please, can one of you be my dad? Just for a little while, I need help." The silence from the other side of the buzzer felt heavier and louder than any noise. It lasted for what felt like an eternity. Leo was sure he had made a terrible mistake. They were probably laughing at him, or calling the police. But then he heard a different sound. A heavy metallic clunk as a lock turned from the inside. The door began to swing slowly open. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, revealing not a bright, scary light, but a dim, shadowy space. The air that drifted out was a mix of old leather, motor oil, and stale coffee. Standing in the doorway was the man from the buzzer. He was huge, with a broad chest that stretched his black t-shirt and a thick graying beard that covered most of his face. His arms were covered in tattoos, a swirling tapestry of colors and shapes that Leo couldn't make out in the dim light. This was the man the others called Grizz, and the name fit him perfectly. For a long moment, Grizz just looked down at the boy. Leo felt like a tiny mouse caught in the shadow of a bear. He wanted to run, to disappear, but his feet were glued to the concrete step. "Well," Grizz rumbled, his voice a little softer now, but still deep enough to feel it in your bones. "You better come in, kid. Can't have you standing out here on the doorstep." He stepped aside, and Leo, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, walked into the clubhouse. His eyes took a second to adjust. The room was large and cluttered. A pool table stood in the middle, its green felt worn thin in spots. A few old, comfortable-looking couches were arranged in a corner, and the walls were covered with photos of motorcycles and groups of men. The winged skull patch was everywhere. A few other men were in the room. One was cleaning a motorcycle part at a table. Another was reading a newspaper. They all stopped what they were doing and looked up. Their faces were serious, etched with lines from years of sun and hard living. No one smiled. The silence was thick and heavy. Leo stood there feeling smaller than ever in his worn-out sneakers and too small jacket. He clutched the strap of his backpack like it was a lifeline. Grizz walked over to a beat-up armchair and sat down, the old leather creaking under his weight. He didn't sit behind a desk like a principal. He was right there on the same level. He gestured to the couch opposite him. "Sit down, son. Take a load off." Leo shuffled over and perched on the very edge of the couch, his back straight, ready to bolt. "You said you need help," Grizz stated. "It wasn't really a question. Start from the beginning. And look at me when you talk." Leo forced himself to lift his gaze from the floor and look into the man's eyes. They were a pale, steady blue, and they weren't angry. They were just waiting. And so Leo began to talk. The words came easier this time, maybe because he had already told his teacher, or maybe because the men in this room felt like a different kind of audience. He told them about his life, about the constant fear that felt like a cold stone in his belly. He told them about his mother's boyfriend, Mark. He described the yelling that made the walls vibrate. He talked about the way Mark would get into a rage over nothing. A spoon left in the sink, the sound of the TV, a look he didn't like. As he spoke, one of the other men stopped cleaning his motorcycle part and just listened, his arms crossed over his chest. Then Leo got to the part about the bruises. He pushed up the sleeve of his jacket, showing the faint yellowish-green marks on his upper arm where strong fingers had gripped him too hard just a few days ago. The men's eyes followed the movement. No one said a word. Finally, he pointed a timid finger to his own face, to the fading purple and yellow around his eye. "And this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He said I was talking back. I wasn't, I was just there." He finished by saying, "My mom, she tries, but she's scared too. There's no one to help us. I thought maybe if you came just once, he'd see that someone knows, that someone sees him, and he'd get scared and go away." He was done. He had poured his whole scared little heart out to a room full of strangers who looked like they could break a man in half. He waited for them to laugh, to tell him it was none of their business, to throw him out. The man who had been reading the newspaper slowly folded it and set it down. The one cleaning the part put his rag aside. They all looked towards a door at the back of the room that Leo hadn't noticed before. It opened and another man walked out. He was older than Grizz, with a bald head and a calm, quiet way of moving that somehow made him seem like the most important person in the room. He wore the same leather vest, the same patches, but on him, they looked like the uniform of a general. This was Jack, the president of the charter. Jack didn't look at the other men. He walked right over and stood in front of Leo. He didn't smile, but his face wasn't unkind. It was thoughtful. He knelt down on one knee, so that his face was level with Leo's. His knees cracked a little as he did, and the simple human sound made him seem less like a giant and more like a man. "Look at me, Leo," Jack said, his voice low and even. It was a voice used to being listened to. Leo looked into his eyes. They were dark and intense, and they held Leo's gaze without blinking. "You showed a lot of guts coming here today," Jack said. "A lot of guts. Most men I know wouldn't have the courage to do what you just did." He paused, letting the words sink in. No one had ever told Leo he was brave before. "You asked for a dad for a day," Jack continued. "Is that right? You just need someone to stand up for you and your mom? To show this man he can't push you around anymore?" Leo could only manage a small, quick nod. Jack looked over at the fading bruise on Leo's face, his jaw tightening just a little. He reached out a large calloused hand. For a second, Leo thought he was going to touch the bruise, and he flinched back instinctively. But Jack's hand stopped. He didn't touch him. Instead, he gently put that heavy hand on Leo's small shoulder. It wasn't a grip. It was a solid, warm weight. It felt like an anchor. "Listen to me," Jack said, his voice firm and clear. "You go to school tomorrow. You act normal. You worry about a single thing. You understand me?" "Not one thing." He gave Leo's shoulder a single reassuring squeeze and then stood up. He turned to the room where all his men were now on their feet watching him. He looked around at their faces, at Grizz, at the others. His expression was hard and decided. "We're paying a visit to that school tomorrow," he announced, his voice filling the quiet room. "All of us. It's time we had a little parent-teacher conference." The next day at school felt like walking through a dream. Leo's stomach was a tangled knot of nerves and a strange, fragile hope. He had done what the man Jack had told him to do. He had gone to school. He tried to act normal. But what was normal? He moved through his classes like a ghost, his ears straining for a sound that wasn't the teacher's voice or the scratch of pencils. He kept glancing out the window, towards the front of the school where the parents usually parked. All he saw were normal cars. A few minivans. A red sedan. Nothing special. With every passing hour, the hope inside him began to shrink, replaced by a cold, heavy feeling of foolishness. Of course they weren't coming. It had been a silly dream. A crazy story, he had told himself. Men like that had better things to do than help a kid like him. The final bell was a sound of doom. It was over. He had been forgotten. He packed his bag slowly, dragging out the moments, not wanting to go home to whatever was waiting for him there. He walked with the crowd of other kids towards the main doors, his head down, and then he heard it. It started as a low rumble in the distance, like faraway thunder on a sunny day. The kids around him didn't seem to notice, too busy chatting and laughing. But Leo's whole body went still. He knew that sound. The rumble grew louder, closer, breaking apart from a single noise into many. It was the deep, throaty growl of not one but many, many motorcycles. The sound echoed off the school walls, drowning out the chatter of the students. Kids started to stop and look around, their faces confused. Then they appeared. One by one, they turned onto the street leading to the school. A line of motorcycles so long it seemed to have no end. The bikes were huge and gleaming, reflecting the afternoon sun. And on each one sat a man, dressed in denim and leather, their vest displaying the winged skull patch. They moved slowly in perfect, rolling formation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the powerful, unified sound of their engines. It wasn't a noisy, chaotic roar. It was a deliberate, powerful statement. Kids and teachers spilled out of the doors, their eyes wide, their mouths hanging open. They pressed against the windows, pointing. The school bully, the one who had shoved Leo just days before, stood frozen on the steps, his face pale as milk. He looked at the bikers, then his eyes darted around, searching the crowd until they landed on Leo. For a single second, their eyes met and the bully quickly looked away, shrinking back into the crowd. The motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, not taking up spaces but forming neat parallel lines. The engines cut off, one by one, and in the sudden ringing silence, the sound of the last engine dying felt louder than the roar had been. The doors of the school opened and the principal, a man with a worried expression, stepped out, followed by Leo's teacher. Ms. Davison. Her hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The bikers dismounted together, their heavy boots hitting the pavement in a series of solid thuds. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They simply stood by their bikes, a silent, unmovable wall of leather and denim. Then the man from the clubhouse, Jack, stepped forward. He was calm. He walked with a quiet authority that made the principal take a small step back. Jack walked right up to the steps. He looked at the principal, then at Leo's teacher, giving her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then his eyes scanned the crowd of stunned children until they found the one small frozen face he was looking for. Leo stood rooted to the spot, his backpack hanging from one hand. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He just stared at the scene in front of him. 32 men. They had all come. For him, Jack's voice broke the silence, calm and clear. "We're here to see Leo," he said to the principal. "We'd like to have a word with him if that's all right." The principal, flustered, just nodded. Of course, Leo. Could you come here, please?" All eyes turned to Leo. He felt 100 stares on him, but for the first time he didn't feel like hiding. He walked forward, his legs feeling weak, until he was standing next to Jack. Jack looked down at him. He didn't hug him. He didn't even smile. But he gave Leo that same slow, deliberate nod he had given him in the clubhouse. It was a look that said, "See? I told you. You don't have to worry." In that moment, standing next to Jack, surrounded by the silent, powerful presence of 32 men who had dropped everything to answer the plea of a scared little boy, Leo felt something he had almost forgotten. He felt safe. The message was not delivered with shouts or threats. It was delivered with presence. It was a silent promise written in leather and steel that echoed louder than any words ever could. They were there. They saw him, and they were not afraid. The show of force in the school parking lot was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples spread out, touching everything. For Leo, the world looked different when he walked out of the principal's office. The other kids didn't shove past him anymore. They looked at him, their eyes filled with a new kind of curiosity, even a little bit of awe. The bully was nowhere to be seen. The silence of the bikers had been louder than any threat. But the bikers knew their job wasn't finished. A show of force starts a conversation. It doesn't solve the problem. As the last motorcycle rumbled away from the school, Jack was already making calls. He didn't call the police to make threats. He called them to make a report. A formal collective statement from 32 witnesses about a child with a bruised eye and a story of fear. Suddenly, the police, who might have hesitated before with just a child's word, had a powerful reason to listen. A detective came to the school the very next day to talk to Leo and his teacher. It wasn't a rushed conversation in a hallway. It was a serious sit-down talk where every word Leo said was written down carefully. At the same time, a man from Child Protective Services, a kind man with a tired face, knocked on the door of Leo's apartment. His mother answered, her eyes red from crying. The man from CPS saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the way she glanced back at her boyfriend, Mark, who was trying to look calm but was sweating. The man asked to speak with the mother and Leo alone. For the first time, with the weight of the world now watching, Leo's mother found a sliver of strength. She told the truth. That very evening, Leo and his mother were taken to a safe place. It wasn't a fancy hotel, just a quiet, clean room in a building downtown for people who needed help. There were no yelling voices, no slamming doors. That first night, the silence in the room was so deep and peaceful that Leo slept through the whole night for the first time in years. Mark was not arrested that day. But the investigation was now open, official, and serious. The shadow of 32 bikers and a police file loomed over him. The word got around their small town. The man who liked to push around women and children found that people looked at him differently now. Shopkeepers were less friendly. Old friends seemed busy. His world got very small very fast. He eventually packed his bags and left town, the pressure too much for a bully to bear. Leo and his mother started the slow, hard process of putting their lives back together. They found a small apartment of their own. It was quiet and it was theirs. Leo's mother got a better job and a little color returned to her cheeks. The Hells Angels did not become Leo's family in the traditional sense. They didn't take him on weekend trips or come for birthday parties. They weren't replacement dads. But they became something else, his guardians. His silent, watchful guardians. A few days after they moved into their new apartment, there was a knock on the door. Leo's mother opened it cautiously. It was Grizz, the big bearded man from the clubhouse. He wasn't wearing his full vest, just a leather jacket. He held a bag of groceries in his massive arms. "Thought you might need a few things," he grumbled, his voice still deep, but softer now. He handed the bag to Leo's mother. It was full of simple, good food: bread, milk, fruit, and a box of cereal. He looked past her and saw Leo standing in the living room. "You doing your homework, kid?" Grizz asked. Leo nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Yes, sir." "Good, keep it up," Grizz said with a firm nod. And then he left, the rumble of his motorcycle fading away down the street. He came by every week or two after that, just for a few minutes. He never came inside. He'd just check on them, make sure the lights were on and that they were okay. Sometimes he'd bring a bag of groceries. Sometimes he'd just ask Leo about school. It was his way of making sure the promise made in the school parking lot was kept. For Leo, the bruised eye finally faded away completely. The memory of the fear began to soften like an old photograph. But the lesson of that time never left him. He learned that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about asking for help when you are. He learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's a promise made by a room full of tough-looking strangers. It's the steady hand of a man named Jack on your shoulder. It's the weekly visit from a man named Grizz, making sure you have milk for your cereal. The bikers didn't change who they were. They were still men who lived a hard life on the road. But for one small, scared boy, they had shown a different side of their code. They had taught him that even in the darkest of times, there can be light. And sometimes that light comes rumbling in on two wheels, a powerful rolling promise that you will never, ever have to be afraid again.